Hello, everyone. As we wait for other attendees to join in, we'll start with a little icebreaker, as you know, everybody loves icebreakers in the world of webinars. So we'll drop in a quick question if you can. I'm interested to know what is that one word that has inspired you to join today. So put it in a chat. Let's keep this going. For me, I'm quite interested in the topic of carbon emissions. Looking forward to hearing from Kat on her insights and from Trace. So quite excited about this session. Let me just see what is happening on the chat community. Great. Love the community. That's what we are all here, CFO community. Development, hot topic. Net zero, this is an interesting term. We'll hear more about it, definitely. Thanks for everyone contributing in. Awesome. So I think now that we have quite a few people join in, we can start. So again, hello everyone, and welcome to the second session of the day, where we'll dive right into sustainability in finance with Kat Long, the co-founder of Trace, the carbon accounting platform and sponsor of today's summit. My name is Nina Putika, and I'm the head of marketing at Wheel. If you're not familiar with Wheel, we are the leading spend management solution in Australia, helping finance teams of all shapes and sizes to control spending and streamline their back office admin. Wheel is obviously the team behind this event, and we are very proud of it to host it for the third year in a row. But this couldn't have happened without our wonderful sponsors. So massive thank you to Visa, Translucent, Fathom, Trace, Mayday, and the CFO magazine for making today possible. In case you're just joining us, this is sort of a quick shout out to the house rules for today. We're really looking to make this session an interactive one and hoping to get everybody engaged because the content is only as good as the audience has received quite a lot of insights from it. So please make sure you stay involved in the session. If you want to ask the question, please do so by using the chat function. So at the bottom of your Zoom panel, you can see the chat function or use the Q&A button. I'll sort of be monitoring the questions and I'll ask Kat at the end of her talk. Oops, sorry. So we are here today, obviously, to discuss a very important topic on sustainability. And I often hear terms such as net zero or carbon neutral sort of being thrown around, but what do they actually mean? And most importantly, what do they mean to you, CFOs and finance professionals? So what is your role to play on this journey towards net zero? So Kat Long, the co-founder and CEO of Trace, is here with us to help us answer these questions. And for the moment, I'll stop sharing my screen and over to you, Kat.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Nina. Please just give me a thumbs up. Oh, I can't see your face now, but I'm going to assume you can see my screen and hopefully hear me well enough. Yes, thank you, Nina. Absolute pleasure to be here. Really grateful to Wheel for allowing us to sponsor and showing that Wheel has a real understanding of the opportunity that finance professionals, CFOs and accountants play in the journey to net zero. So thank you for inviting me. My goal today is to really do a bit of a 101 and cover some of those phrases and terminology that Nina mentioned that often gets so confused. I think of sustainability as a bit of an acronym salad. Unfortunately, there's just terms all over the place. There's lots of new acronyms. So I'm hoping to cut through some of that noise today and help all of you on this call understand the role that you play in reducing carbon emissions and what you can actually do about it for either your own firm or for your clients. So let me just start off by introducing myself. As Nina said, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Trace. I think the best way to think of Trace is like a zero for carbon reporting. So just like zero, we use accounting data, we're a reporting platform, and we can use directly by companies or by accountants working on behalf of their clients. And I'll go into a bit more detail about how it works later. So today I want to cover some of the most common questions I get asked about net zero, what it means and how it works. And I'm actually going to start with a bit of a 101 on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, because I'm sure many of you know a lot about this, but it's always good to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about and why it is so important that we start acting today. So this is probably my favorite sort of representation of what the greenhouse gas effect is, i.e. climate change. As you can see here, basically you've got the sun reaching the earth, and some of that heat is reflected and some of it is absorbed and radiated. The most heat is absorbed by greenhouse gases, and unfortunately that is causing the earth to warm up. So you probably heard lots of different stats around this, but we're generally seeing a global average temperature rise of 1%, or sorry, 1 degree centigrade. I think it's nearly 1.5 now, since the Industrial Revolution. So think of greenhouse gases as essentially acting like a blanket around the world. And it is these greenhouse gases that we need to reduce in order to prevent irreversible climate change. So let's just take a step back in terms of like where the planet is in terms of setting goals for climate mitigation. Scientists believe that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees to pre-industrial levels in order to prevent irreversible damage. Now, in 2015, the Paris Agreement marked a binding international agreement that states that all governments need to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. The reason I've crossed out 2050 is that many scientists have since dated that number and said, we haven't got time, we need to do this by 2030. So the clock is very much ticking. Now, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, governments and the private sector have really rallied to make net zero a reality. And I'm sure you've all seen lots of press articles and announcements from companies all showing this. So to give you a few stats, net zero targets, the latest stats I could find, actually cover 88% of global emissions. They are equivalent to 92% of global GDP, the companies that have made commitments, and around 50% of the largest publicly listed companies actually now have net zero targets. So there's been a real movement, and it's probably why net zero is now very much on your agenda. But what do we actually mean? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what net zero means. And the issue is that how we get there, the pathway is actually relatively unknown because some of the technology required either doesn't exist yet or is too expensive. So let me just set the scene. Net zero is defined as a 90% reduction, or hopefully more, in today's baseline emissions. So whether that's a company's emissions, a personal, a human's emissions, or a government's emissions, net zero means a 90% reduction. Now, you've probably seen people talk about carbon offsets and the role they play in net zero, which is something I'll come on to in a second. But you can see here that a lot of companies and governments use carbon offsetting today to neutralize those emissions. But when it comes to net zero, that carbon actually needs to be permanently removed. So that's this bit on the right. Anything that's hard to abate, that might be fuel from planes, leftover emissions from electricity. We need to abate that with permanent carbon removals. So that's what net zero means. And let's contrast that to some of the other terms that you might have come across in the literature or on the news. Let's start with carbon neutral, the one on the left, because that's the most common term that we hear being thrown around. It's often used by products and consumer goods companies saying we're a carbon neutral product, for example. And what that means is it's an existing state where an organization or a product is balancing all of its emissions with carbon credits or carbon offsets and using that as a way to neutralize their emissions. Now, it's not a proactive reduction. Increasingly, you do need to set reduction targets, but carbon neutral is kind of a current state. Carbon positive, which is confusingly often referred to as carbon negative, is then takes it to the next step. And it basically means that a company or an organization has offset more than their carbon footprint. So they're sort of in negative balance and ultimately having a carbon positive impact. But still, this is a current state and not actually contributing towards net zero. So as I explained on the previous slide, net zero means a 90% reduction from the baseline and the remainder permanently removed. So if you hear a company say we are net zero today, I challenge you to ask them whether that can be possible, because net zero means you must have reduced emissions 90%, and it's incredibly hard to do that overnight. The final one on the right is a term that I've seen quite a few companies use as a sort of future state or vision or goal, which is called climate positive. And it ultimately means that we're having a net benefit that goes beyond net zero emissions and means that all of our activities are actually promoting promoting climate and preserving the planet, so having a net positive impact. Unfortunately, it's very hard to measure that, and there's no sort of standards governing it. So again, that term should be used with caution. So how do we get to net zero? Well, at Trace, we've defined 6 processes that a company or an organization should use to reach net zero. Firstly, starting with setting your baseline. Now, this is what's known as carbon accounting, which I'll go into today. You then set targets, so you try and set an ambition for reducing emissions by 90%. You then need to commit and share those in order to really hold yourself accountable, and then make plans to reduce. And that's an ongoing impact exercise that you need to do on an annual basis. Reporting is a really big part of this and relevant to all of you on the call, which I'll come on to in a minute. And then mitigation is what you might do at the very last step to remove any unavoidable emissions. So carbon accounting is something that I want to spend time on today because it is very relevant to the finance industry, and I'm sure very relevant to all of the companies that you're at or the clients that you serve. So why has it suddenly got onto the CFO's agenda? The simple answer is it's now part of legislation. So these are all the countries, actually probably not exhaustive, but some of the largest economies that have recently put mandatory climate disclosures into law. So that means that they're actually mandating companies within their jurisdictions to report annually and publicly on their carbon emissions. So I think the Treasury here in Australia estimates that by FY28, about 20,000 companies will actually be subject to mandatory disclosures. And that's from a sort of baseline of about 500 that need to report today. So it's a huge increase in the number of businesses that will be required to report climate. Here's how the Australian government is planning to roll out their mandatory disclosures from FY25. So next year, some of the largest firms in Australia, anyone with over 500 employees, a billion in assets or 500 million in revenues will need to report. And then you can see that gets phased out up until 2028. Now, Joe Longer, the ASIC Classic chair, has recently said that this is the biggest change to corporate reporting in a generation. This is a crucial point. You have to do this now. It's simply not an option to put this off until after legislation has passed and then scramble to comply. And I think that's a really interesting point because a lot of companies we talk to say, oh, we don't need to do this for another 3 years, so we're going to put it off. And then the ones that do start realize that it's going to be a big shift in culture and process, and they're glad they started early. But you might be thinking here, hang on a second, this doesn't apply to my business. We don't fall into one of those categories that I explained. So the 500 million in revenues or a billion in assets. But the reality is that all businesses are going to get swept up by this legislation. And let me explain to you why. The reason is scope 3 emissions. And what that means is emissions from your supply chain. Now, on the right is just a handful of companies that in the last year have announced that if you want to do business with them, so if you're a supplier to Coles or AstraZeneca or Amazon, you are going to need to report and disclose your carbon emissions to them in order to do business with them. This is a huge shift for a lot of small businesses, and why I believe the finance profession, particularly accountants, have a huge role to play to enable this shift. So why do I believe that's the case? Well, 75% of investors want independent assurance over these climate risk plans and reports. You know, once they become public, we need to have confidence in them. So that's where the finance profession plays a really strong role in ensuring the reporting is rigorous. The clock is ticking. As I explained, we've got less than 6 months until Australia's climate reporting regime becomes a reality. There's already a regime in place for the largest companies in New Zealand, and that's likely to trickle down to smaller businesses too. And a recent survey showed that 2/3 of SMEs just are terrified they don't have the internal skills to tackle this or to do climate reporting. We believe that accountants, finance professionals, and bookkeepers are perfectly placed to provide carbon accounting services. So to help their clients or their business report on their carbon emissions in a rigorous way. Why do we believe that? Well, a lot of the data that carbon accounting use comes from existing accounting platforms like Xero, QuickBooks, Mild, etc. You already have the rigor and professionalism. Most people in finance have many degrees and are well trained in analytics and audit. You've got the trusted relationships either with your clients or with your internal stakeholders, and you have the capacity to add advisory skills. So we see this as a really exciting opportunity for accountants to grab this as a new service that they can offer to their clients. So who is Trace and what do we do? Well, as I mentioned before, we kind of see ourselves as a bit of a Xero for carbon reporting, but think of us as your partner in carbon accounting as a service. Our platform ingests data from existing platforms that your clients or your firm is using, anything from spreadsheets that you're tracking travel on, Xero, MyOb, all the accounting platforms we mentioned, utility bills, employee surveys. We can ingest all of that data, and out of the other side, you will get a comprehensive carbon report. You'll be able to define a carbon reduction plan. You'll be able to engage your employees, and you'll be able to set yourself targets for reduction as well. So how does this work in practice? Like, how might you as a company or a firm start rolling this out to your clients or internally? Well, we always recommend starting by example, leading by example. Your firm, if it's selling carbon accounting as a service, should lead by example and actually start the journey to net zero yourself. So you understand that process and you have empathy for the process and the effort required. Second, and most importantly, and why I'm here today, is all about upskilling and education. Trace has a proprietary training program, which we call our Carbon Accounting Fellowship, which we offer to in-house private and public accountants in order to help you understand and gain the skills required to offer carbon accounting to your services, to your clients. We then suggest you pilot this so you can use Trace with a handful of clients that might be asking for your services today or that you want to try it out with. And then finally, we can help you launch and market your services to your clients. To bring this to life, I just want to give you a quick case study of one of these in action. So these three parties, including Trace, have recently partnered to help PenCS on the right report its carbon emissions. Now, PenCS is an Australian-owned health information company, so an IT company. One of its largest clients is AstraZeneca. And you might remember from the previous slide about Scope 3, that AstraZeneca is one of the large companies that has mandated that any of their suppliers need to report their carbon emissions. So last year, PenCS gets this email from AstraZeneca saying, in order to do business with us, we need you to share your carbon emissions. PenCS doesn't have a sustainability team. They've never done this before, so they reached out to their accountants who are Veridity. Now, Veridity happens to be a partner of Trace, and they said, not to worry, we can actually help you measure your emissions and do the heavy lifting for you using Trace as the platform to calculate those emissions. Within a couple of weeks, PenCS had entered the data, Veridity had checked that and made sure it was rigorous and complete, and Trace then produced its carbon report, which PenCS could then share to AstraZeneca and ensure that it could renew its client agreement. So that's just bringing to life how some of these smaller businesses around Australia and New Zealand might use their accountants to achieve this outcome and leverage Trace as the platform to make that possible. I hope that would only be 15, 20 minutes, which it sure was. So I would love to, and I always find the best part of these presentations is always Q&A, because I know that was a lot of acronyms and a lot of new information with lots of people. So I would be really grateful for any tricky questions. Please throw them my way. Anything that didn't make sense, I'd be more than happy to dig into.
Awesome. Thanks, Kat, for this such an engaging presentation. And it obviously is a very crucial topic, both for businesses and global economy as a whole. And it emphasizes the needs for us to be strategic thinkers in this area and also amongst the CFOs and industry leaders. There were some questions on the topic of the audio. and some of the comments. So I just want to apologize to the audience for some of the audio quality issues. It seems that we were experiencing some technical difficulties that were unfortunately beyond our control. So thank you for your understanding and patience. I hope that you were able to get the message and hear the most important key takeaways, and we will be providing the written transcript as well as the recording of the session. And also we'll share CAS details. So if anyone is willing to chat post the presentation, you'll be able to get through. So there are a couple of questions that are quite interesting on this topic. So let me go to Risha's question. She said, the issue with carbon accounting is that it masks the actual issue rather than solves it. What changes do you think will make the most impact to reducing carbon emission?
Yeah, Risha, that's a really interesting point, and I really hope you can hear me. I apologize if the audio quality was poor, but hopefully you'll get my answer here. It's a great question. Look, I think the old adage of what you can measure, you can manage is why carbon accounting is so important. Most of the clients that we work with don't understand where their emissions come from. So where are they expected to start reducing where they don't know where the opportunity is? So carbon accounting is just one of the many tools to help us reduce emissions. It obviously alone will not get us to net zero, but what it does is help expose where the company's emissions are and therefore where they should prioritize their efforts or investments. Secondly, it holds them accountable. And this is where the mandatory disclosures are really important, because it actually means businesses that are publicly disclosing their emissions sort of feel the pressure to show that they're making progress. You know, if they're still reporting in 5 years' time and their emissions are just going up, they're going to start losing clients over that, because their emissions contribute to their clients' emissions. So that's why carbon accounting and measurement is such an important tool in the journey to net zero. But you're right, it doesn't actually solve the problem. What do I think will make the most impact? I mean, I think it's 40 or so% of global carbon emissions come from the energy sector. So no surprises that that's where most of the effort needs to go. Now, the challenge can often be for smaller businesses that they don't always have control over which energy provider they use, or perhaps they are leasing a property, so they can't choose to put solar panels, for example, on their roof. So this is where engaging your supply chain, engaging your landlord, and having those open conversations is what will truly move the needle. Because if every corporate office, for example, is being asked by their tenants to switch to renewable energy, eventually they're going to have to do that, otherwise they will lose business. So again, you can measure, you can manage, and it gives you the tools to be able to have those conversations and start making real change.
Awesome. I love that. I love that because it does give us the accountability and keeps us honest to the promise. An interesting question on how do finance professionals stay informed about these sort of evolving regulations related to carbon emissions and sustainability? Like, what's the best way for them to stay up to date?
It's a great question, and I certainly am not here to plug Trace, but honestly, if I had found one tool that or one source of information that gave me everything I need in a digestible format, I would most certainly be sharing it with you. But unfortunately, there's quite a lot of different sources out there, and it's hard to keep on top of them. So we try our best to read all of the latest legislation and keep on top of that. And we have a newsletter and LinkedIn feed that's quite active in promoting, and keeping you informed. We've also got anyone in our partner program, which is free to join. We keep them updated via Slack. We've got a community where we share relevant news. So please do get in touch on our website if you want to do that. As for Australia, the main source is Treasury. They're the ones that are releasing the actual legislation, and same goes for New Zealand. The government releases that, but as you can imagine, it's very long documents. It's quite hard to read and hard to digest. The big four actually do a pretty good job of, and actually the legal firms do a pretty good job of summarizing a lot of the legislation, but it's very disaggregated. So I think just pick one legal firm or one big accounting firm, or, come to Trace, and they will always be staying on top of the latest announcements and evolving regulations.
Awesome. Thank you. There is one more great question from Nick Grady. How do you recommend engaging with investors and other stakeholders to communicate the benefits of reporting on their carbon emissions?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, this is what we do every day. Often we are talking to, it might be the CFO, the CEO, many different stakeholders within an organization. They say, yep, this is absolutely on our list, but it's just not the top of the list because every business is busy and has a lot of competing priorities. So being able to communicate the benefits is really important. So that's a great question. I think it comes down to the client's or the company's drivers. So the four main reasons we see a company start measuring is either because it's directly impacted by mandatory disclosures. It's not hard to sell the benefits then. It's a tick box or a stick in that case. But the other ones are if your investors are starting to ask. So you might have a private equity investor, a venture capital investor, or you might have debt from a bank. Those financial institutions are increasingly looking at the emissions from the companies that they finance. So if they don't already, are very likely to start asking for those emissions soon. So you want to be ahead of that so that you can access financing. My hope is that you'll actually have access to cheaper financing as well if you're able to show your sustainability credentials. So there's a definite kind of CFO and financing benefit there too. The other one is kind of brand benefits. If you can turn your carbon reporting into a really authentic story around why sustainability and climate matters to you as an organization, it builds really strong brand credentials. And we've all seen it done well. We've also all seen it done badly. You need to be authentic. You need to be telling the story about what you've learned, what you're addressing, and what, frankly, you're unable to address. And that's something that we're really passionate about, is that storytelling, so that you can gain some marketing benefits. And the final one, and actually I think the one that excites me the most, is that it's really strong. It's a really strong driver of employee engagement. I think a recent report by Atlassian showed that about 67% of Gen Z actually choose the company to work for based on their sustainability credentials, because they have climate anxiety, right? They're actually looking to work for companies that align to their values. So if you've got a carbon report on your website and you can show that you have a genuine strategy to reduce emissions, that's actually going to be great for attracting new talent, and of course great for retaining them as well.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. I think that absolutely resonates with everyone on this call. We have one question about Trace in particular. So our large corporate customers require us to use other tools that they pay for, so probably some other platforms and tools. So does Trace sync with these global leaders in a space to cut our doubling of efforts?
Yeah, interesting. Not right now, but that's something we're exploring. So I'm glad you asked, because we're always trying to figure out who we need to integrate with. All the what you get is a sort of carbon ledger, for want of a better word, when you use Trace, and that can all be exported into a spreadsheet. So the best option is you go through your carbon assessment using Trace. Your accountant then kind of verifies that and helps you gather the data. And then if you need to pull it into another BI tool, you can actually just scrape that data. It's just a very simple ledger that can then be presented or uploaded into an existing tool. But I'd love to know which tools they are, because we are exploring APIs.
Awesome. Lovely. So I would encourage the audience to ask any other questions. I think we've answered most of them, from at least we grouped them together and answered most of them. We can, let me just bring up the slide about our next presentation. I am not able to.
You need me to, hang on a second, stop sharing.
There you go. Lovely. So we'll obviously give some time back to everyone. Grab yourself a coffee, second coffee for the day, stretch your legs for our next two sessions. So we have two sessions starting at 11 a.m., which they are building a scalable tech stack that grows with your business. We'll Tyler Kasky from Devine Counters and Mark Donovan, CFO at Metro Finance, and scale your business on zero without needing a dozen other apps and add-ons, with Heather Smith from Ennis Consulting and Michael Wood from Translucent. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Massive thanks to you, Kat, for sharing with us your incredible insights on this very, very important topic. Hope everybody has lots and taken lots to think about, and we'll be working with your teams on how you start reporting onto carbon emission and working with Trace on this. So we'll see you over in a couple of minutes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.